she inherited a mysterious forest house from an uncle she barely remembered. No one told her what was waiting inside. No keys, no instructions, just a set of coordinates deep in the woods. But the moment she stepped inside, she felt it. Something wasn't right. And when the first storm hit, she discovered a hidden secret buried beneath the floor. A secret that would change everything. Subscribe for more emotional stories and let us know where you're watching from. The envelope arrived on a dull Wednesday morning. Its corners worn like it had been handled too many times before reaching her hands. Claire stood by the sink in the cramped kitchen of her rented mobile home. Coffee gone cold behind her, while her son, Jack, wrestled with his homework at the fold-out table. He was unusually quiet. Kids know when something shifts, even if they don't have the words yet. She tore open the letter, expecting another overdue notice, but the words inside were different, detached, legal, final. Her uncle, a man she barely remembered, had left her a property, a house, hidden somewhere deep in a forested stretch of Vermont she hadn't thought of in years. The letter listed coordinates, a deadline, and no explanation. She read it again, then again. There had been no funeral, no phone call, just this, a gift, or a burden. Jack looked up from his math sheet. Sensing the air had thickened, she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Everything's fine. She lied. But the house in the woods was calling silent, steady, and strange. That night, long after Jack had gone to bed, she sat in the dark, staring at the map, and the next morning, she started packing. They left at dawn 2 weeks later. The car was old, but dependable, an aging Subaru with a cracked windshield and an engine that coughed to life each morning like it needed convincing. The trunk was packed tight. More out of caution than optimism, blankets, canned food, clothes layered for every season, a toolkit Claire barely remembered how to use, and a stack of Jack's books tucked between rolled sleeping bags. Jack sat in the back seat, forehead against the window, silently counting telephone poles and rusted-out sheds as they rolled past the edge of town. He didn't complain. He didn't ask questions. But Claire could feel the weight of everything unspoken filling the space between them. The city dissolved behind them without ceremony. No one knew they were leaving, not really. There'd been no dramatic goodbyes, no hugs in parking lots, just a quiet erasure, mile by mile. Claire followed the GPS as far as she could. After a while, even that stopped helping. The roads grew thinner, cracked and buckled by frost, then gave way to gravel, then dirt. Eventually, they weren't roads at all, just vague paths that seemed more like suggestions than directions. Somewhere between two nameless turns, her phone lost signal. She stared at the blank screen and surprisingly felt relief, like a cord had been cut, like the outside world couldn't reach them here, for better or worse. When they finally reached the coordinates, it was late afternoon. Pale winter sun hung low behind a web of bare branches. There were no fences, no mailbox, no welcome sign, just a subtle change in the way the ground dipped, in the way the trees pulled back from a clearing that didn't want to be found. And then, there it was. The house didn't look like a house at all. It rose from the forest floor in a low, rounded shape, an earthen dome, blending into the landscape as though the forest had grown around it. Its surface was textured, the color of old clay and dried moss. From a distance, it could have been mistaken for a hill, a forgotten mound left behind by some prehistoric event. There were no sharp lines, no visible seams, just curves, soft, silent, secret. Jack was the first to speak. "It looks like something sleeping." Claire didn't know what to say. He wasn't wrong. The door was barely visible, set low into the curve of the wall, framed by wood that had gone silver with age. She hesitated before touching it, suddenly aware of how loud the forest had become in its quiet. Wind moved through the branches in high whispers. Snow crunched beneath her boots. The handle was cold, heavier than it looked, but it turned without protest. Inside, the air shifted. Not warm, not cold, just still. No smell of mold, no rot, no sharp sting of abandonment. Instead, it smelled faintly of earth and time. Light filtered in through narrow, deep-set openings in the wall, slanting inward like it had been invited in, but only on the house's terms. Jack stepped inside beside her. He ran his hand along the wall. "It's warm," he said softly. Claire frowned. He was right. Not heated, but insulated. The air held steady, as if untouched by the wind clawing at the trees outside. There were no rooms in the traditional sense, just curved spaces that flowed into each other. Sleeping alcoves carved into the thickness of the walls. A table molded directly from the floor. Shelves formed from the same continuous material. It felt deliberate, as though the house hadn't been built, but grown. Outside, the last light was fading. Shadows stretched long across the clearing. Claire stood near the center of the space and turned slowly, taking it in. It was small, quiet. It shouldn't have felt like anything. And yet, it felt like it was watching her back, waiting. Jack sat down cross-legged on the floor, as if the house had already given him permission. She watched him for a long moment before sinking down beside him, still unsure whether she'd just made the worst mistake of her life or something else entirely. At night, they slept inside the dome for the first time. No heat, no electricity, just the blankets they brought and the breath they shared. Outside, the wind picked up, sharp against the outer wall, but inside, the quiet wrapped around them not silent, but absorbing. As Claire lay awake, staring at the curved ceiling, she didn't feel warm, but she didn't feel cold either. She felt watched over by something old and patient and still listening. The first few days blurred together like fog on a winter morning. Claire and Jack explored the dome slowly, careful not to rush what felt sacred. There was no electricity, no running water. Cooking had to be done outside on a simple stone fire ring, its blackened edges suggesting years of use. The firewood, stacked under a crude, circular overhang, was dry despite the frost. Someone, maybe her uncle, had known how to prepare for a long absence. The neighbors came on the third day. They arrived in the late afternoon. 2 men and a woman, dressed in thick coats and suspicion. They didn't knock, just stood near the fire ring, watching the dome like it had offended them. Claire stepped out, heart thudding. "You're the niece?" one of them asked, voice tight. "I am," she replied cautiously. "You planning on staying?" the woman asked, glancing sideways at the structure. "For now." They didn't hide their disbelief. "You know that thing won't hold up in a real freeze, right?" One man scoffed. "It'll rot from the inside or burn from the outside. Either way, it'll fail." Claire didn't respond. She didn't know how to argue something she hadn't decided to believe in herself. Later that evening, she and Jack lit a fire outside. He stirred lentils over the flame while she inspected the curved walls of the dome. Not a single draft, not even the faintest tremble from the wind outside. "Why did they laugh?" Jack asked without looking up. She hesitated. People laugh when they're scared, or when they don't understand. He nodded like he already knew. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, Claire lay awake, tracing the lines of the ceiling with her eyes. The dome wasn't loud, but it wasn't silent either. It listened, it breathed, and sometimes, in the hush between gusts of wind, she thought she heard movement, a faint shift in the air, a low hum in the walls. She told herself it was nothing. But on the fifth night, Jack woke her. He stood beside her makeshift bed, barefoot on the earthen floor, eyes wide and alert. "Mom," he whispered. "There's something warm under the middle." Claire blinked. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It's warmer there, always is." She sat up. Jack walked back to the center of the dome and knelt, pressing his palm flat to the stone circle embedded in the floor. Claire followed. He was right. It wasn't just warm. It was steady, a slow, deep heat, rising from below like breath from lungs buried beneath the ground. Claire stared at the circle, heart pounding now for a different reason. She'd seen it before, just assumed it was decorative, or maybe a support. But now, she realized it wasn't flush with the rest of the floor. There was an edge, a seam, almost invisible. "Do you think it's a heater?" Jack asked. She almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. "There's no power, Jack." "Then how?" She didn't have the answer. Over the next few days, she paid more attention. The temperature inside the dome never dipped as low as it should have. The wind didn't cut through. The cold didn't settle like it did in her old apartment, creeping in through window panes and floorboards. It was like the dome absorbed the outside, transformed it, and returned something softer, slower. Still, a knot of unease tightened in her chest. What was this place? And what had her uncle been trying to show her? She started searching for clues carefully, lifting old blankets tucked into the walls, running her hands over the curved shelves, checking for cracks or storage compartments or anything. But the dome gave nothing away. Not until she stepped outside. Behind the house, half sunken into the earth, was a structure she'd somehow missed. A short distance from the dome, under a wooden awning, stood a stone cylinder blackened with old soot. A fire pit, but wrong. It looked like a chimney buried in the ground, wide enough for logs, built too close to the house for comfort, yet far enough to make you question its purpose. Claire crouched and ran her fingers along the edge, cold, rough, scorched. She lit a fire inside it the next morning, more out of curiosity than need. Jack watched from a distance. The flame caught fast, burned clean, and 2 hours later, she felt it. Inside the dome. Not sudden warmth, but presence, as if the house was holding its breath, then slowly, deliberately, exhaling. Claire stood in the center again. Over the stone circle, her feet felt it first, then her hands, then her heart. The house was alive with something ancient, something deliberate, and she hadn't even begun to understand it. Claire used to believe shelter was just 4 walls and a locked door. But the dome was something else. She woke up before sunrise now, not because she had to, but because the house seemed to ask for it. The morning light filtered in through a narrow window carved so deep into the wall it barely let wind through. But it caught the first hint of gold and scattered it across the floor like an invitation. Jack had adjusted faster than she expected. He no longer asked when they were going home. He no longer called the dome weird. He'd started calling it ours. It wasn't warmth in the usual sense. The dome didn't chase away the cold like a heater might. It held it, refracted it. It seemed to measure each breath of winter, offering only as much resistance as necessary, never more, And Claire, she was learning to listen. She had stopped expecting the house to prove itself. Instead, she found herself adjusting her expectations. The house didn't bend to her. It taught her how to move. It was subtle things, like how the floor near the walls cooled first at night, but the center stayed warm even after the fire had died, or how sound moved differently inside, how a whisper near the door was louder than one at the back, or how the shelves carved into the walls seemed to anticipate her needs. Some were shallow and narrow, perfect for kindling and dried herbs. Others, deeper and insulated, held root vegetables longer than they should have. It was a system, she realized, and her uncle hadn't just built a home. He had designed a living organism. One morning, as Jack crouched near the center, his fingers tracing the outline of the hidden slab again, he looked up and said, "It remembers things." Claire paused. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, thoughtful. "It feels like it remembers what it's supposed to do, even when we don't." She didn't respond, but her chest ached at the truth in his words. After that, she began taking notes, drawing small diagrams, tracing temperature changes with her hands, measuring time by the position of light beams and the warmth underfoot. She noticed that when she lit the fire outside in the sunken chimney, the heat from it didn't just rise, it somehow traveled. Slowly, subtly, seeping into the slab at the center like water into a sponge. The dome wasn't just absorbing heat, it was storing it, regulating it, releasing it on a delay, like it knew when the nights would bite hardest. And she had missed it. At first, all those years renting drafty apartments, fighting with broken thermostats, juggling rent and bills, her idea of shelter had been noise and reaction. But this place was designed around prevention. It didn't fight nature, it danced with it. One afternoon, while chopping wood outside, the woman from the neighboring homestead returned, alone this time. She didn't mock the house now. She stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the dome with narrowed eyes. "It's still warm in there?" she asked. Claire nodded. "Still dry?" "Yes." A pause. "You know, we laughed when we heard about your uncle building this thing. Said he'd lost it, living like a mole in a mud bubble." Claire said nothing. The woman looked at the fire ring, where a faint glow of embers still curled lazily in the stone base. "It's not just mud, is it?" Claire shook her head. "No. It's layered. Clay, straw, stone. He used thermal mass, probably based it on old earth-building techniques, passive heating. He even separated the fire from the structure. Smart. Smart enough to survive without the grid." The woman looked down, then back up. Her face was softer this time. "Some of us lost power last night. Just blinked out. Still off." Claire felt the weight of her words. That night, the wind returned fierce and biting. The trees groaned. Snow fell sideways. The dome didn't flinch. Inside. Claire sat beside Jack as he traced light patterns on the curved ceiling. "Do you miss the apartment?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. No. It never listened back. She looked around. The walls held warmth like a secret. The air didn't hum with machines it rested. The dome didn't shelter them. It cradled them. And suddenly, the inheritance wasn't just something she'd received. It was something asking to be understood. The storm arrived without warning. Claire had grown used to the hush of snow. But this one didn't arrive soft, it roared. Winds slammed into the trees like fists. Snow fell not in flakes, but in sheets, horizontal and violent, turning the clearing into a pale blur where nothing held still. The dome stood solid, its curved back to the wind. unfazed, but inside, the air was different. It wasn't cold exactly, not yet, but it wasn't holding warmth like before. Claire felt it first in her fingers as she tied up firewood, then in her breath as it lingered longer in the air. She added wood to the outside fire cautiously, watching the flame rise against the screaming wind. Jack sat inside, drawing in his notebook, his cough soft but persistent. She didn't want to panic. Panic was wasteful. She focused on the rhythm they'd built, the daily checks, the fire schedule, the stored food and heat cycles. But something was off. The dome was reacting slower. By midnight, she could feel the chill at the base of the walls. Only the center stayed warm. That circle the hidden slab was doing more than usual. Jack curled up near it without needing to be told. "Mom," he said, voice low. "Why does the heat stay here longer?" Claire crouched beside him, placed her hand flat on the stone. It was unmistakable. The warmth wasn't just residual, it was being held and released, like a living thing. She stared at it, realization blooming slowly in her chest like fire catching on dry wood. This was never just a floor. It was the heart of the system. She stood up, pushed aside the thin rug that covered the stone, and looked for a seam anything. Her fingers found the groove she'd overlooked before, a shallow ridge near the edge. She pressed, lifted. The slab didn't scream or groan. It shifted reluctantly, releasing a deep breath of warmth that rolled out like a sigh trapped for days. Beneath it was a cavity, lined in dark stone, earth-packed and dry, and warm. Not from fire, from storage, from design. Claire knelt, stunned. This was the source, the dome's secret. Her uncle hadn't just created insulation. He'd built a thermal core. All those fires she'd lit in the external stove, all that heat, it hadn't disappeared into the air. It had gone somewhere, into this chamber, hidden below their feet, a reservoir, slowly filling, slowly returning. Not wasteful, not immediate, but faithful, steady. She replaced the slab gently, sealing it again, reverent. Within minutes, she felt the shift. The air in the dome settled. The tension softened. The warmth began to spread not fast, but with intention. Jack's cough eased. His breathing slowed. Claire sat beside him on the floor, arms around her knees, heart still racing not from fear, but from awe. Her uncle hadn't left her a house. He'd left her an answer. The next morning, the storm still raged. Snowdrifts had swallowed the path. Trees bowed under weight. The world had gone quiet in its chaos. But the dome held. Claire moved through the space like she was seeing it for the first time. Every shelf, every curve, every choice measured. Nothing wasted. No luxury, but no carelessness. She understood now why the fire was outside, why the house absorbed instead of reacted, why the center stayed warm when everything else dimmed. It wasn't eccentricity. It was preparation. That afternoon, through the white blur beyond the windows, she saw shadows moving. People, struggling against wind, coming toward the dome. Neighbors. Claire stepped outside into the howling white and met them at the fire pit. They looked worn, cold. One held a small child shivering under blankets. No one mocked her house now. No one asked stupid questions. They just stood there, silent, waiting. Claire didn't speak. She simply added more wood to the fire and stepped aside. One by one, they gathered near the flames. Some wept quietly. Others closed their eyes, just grateful for warmth. And in that moment, Claire understood something her uncle must have known for a long time. You don't build something like this to impress people. You build it for when everything else fails. Claire no longer saw the dome as strange. It didn't matter that it was built without corners or that the stove was outside, buried in snow. The dome worked, and that changed everything. The neighbors didn't come often after the storm, but when they didn't laugh anymore. Their tone had shifted from amused dismissal to quiet questions. How did the walls stay warm so long? How had she kept the firewood dry? Why hadn't the roof caved in under all that weight? Claire answered when she could, but there were no grand speeches. She wasn't trying to prove anything. The house spoke for itself now. Jack had changed, too. He no longer asked if the lights would come back on or why the internet didn't work. He measured his days in light and sound, in how the warmth moved through the dome after each fire. He knew where to sit when the air cooled near the walls. He could tell just by listening whether the fire outside was burning too hot or not enough. Sometimes, Claire watched him without saying a word, how naturally he had adapted, how easily he had let go of the noise of the life they left behind. She was slower to change. Her instincts still fought the silence. The part of her shaped by fluorescent lights and deadlines wanted control, wanted guarantees. But the dome offered no such promises. It offered rhythm, balance, a conversation between heat and time, stone and skin. And finally, she was starting to hear it. She understood now that this house had never been built for comfort. It was built for continuity. She found the journals a week after the storm, tucked into a hidden shelf behind a recessed panel in the wall, wrapped in oiled cloth. Pages of diagrams and notes, all in her uncle's tight, precise handwriting. The language was mechanical, almost cold calculations about thermal mass, energy retention, moisture insulation, optimal fire cycles. But between the lines, Claire saw something else. Intention. This wasn't the work of a man trying to escape the world. It was the work of someone trying to build through it, to outlast the systems that failed, to give someone maybe her a way to live without begging for power or permission. One passage stood out. Don't build for approval, build for pressure. Build for the day the lights don't come back on, when fuel is short, when laughter turns into need. If a child depends on it, it cannot fail. Claire closed the notebook slowly. A child. He had written this for her, or for Jack, or maybe for someone he never got to raise. It didn't matter now. The message was clear. This wasn't a gift, it was a responsibility. Claire began doing more than surviving. She began tending, caring, not like a homeowner, but like a steward. She rotated the food stocks, checked the stonework after every freeze. She tracked where snow melted first, where the wind hit hardest, how long the internal warmth lasted each night. She repacked the firewood with a new sense of purpose, every log placed not just for use, but for insulation, for airflow, for efficiency. And Jack helped. He knew what tools to hand her without being told. He asked the right questions. Not are we okay, but how long will this warmth hold and can we make it last longer? He'd stopped asking if they would leave. One night, as they sat beside the center slab, watching the last of the day's heat rise from the floor, he looked up at her with quiet certainty. I think he built it for us, even if he didn't know it. Claire nodded, eyes stinging. Maybe he did. They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. The dome held them in silence, a silence that wasn't empty but earned, full of lessons and fire and decisions that had weight. This place was no longer a mystery. It was a blueprint. A life designed not around comfort, but resilience. and Claire had finally stepped into the role it required. She was no longer just someone who had inherited something. She was someone who understood it. Spring didn't arrive with fanfare. It came slowly, like the dome itself, quiet, deliberate, unwilling to make promises. The snow didn't vanish overnight. It melted in patches, revealing cold earth and crushed grass, soaked in months of silence, but inside the dome. Claire felt it before she saw it. The air was changing, softer, less guarded. For the first time in months, she opened the ventilation flaps fully. The house didn't resist. It simply adjusted like it always had. She walked the perimeter that morning, not out of fear, but curiosity. The walls were dry, the roof unbent by the weight of snow, the layers of straw and clay intact. The structure had endured, not in spite of its simplicity, but because of it. It didn't just survive the winter. It earned spring. Jack had grown in ways Claire couldn't measure with a tape or a scale. He moved through the house with quiet confidence, noticing things she missed: how the warmth stayed longer on some days, how the wind had shifted direction, how water pooled differently near the woodpile. He didn't speak much of the storm anymore, or the boy who had slept by the fire with blue lips and thin blankets. But when he did, it wasn't with fear, it was with clarity. "We were ready," he'd said one evening. And they were. Not because of luck, not because of help, but because someone had built something with the long view in mind. Someone who'd asked, what happens when systems fail? What happens when you can't depend on what everyone else takes for granted? Claire thought of her uncle often now, not as the eccentric loner people had laughed at, but as a quiet architect of resilience, a man who had traded convention for precision, popularity for intention. And the more she lived inside his creation, the more she realized he hadn't just been preparing for isolation. He'd been preparing for interruption, for collapse, for the kind of world where survival didn't depend on panic but on design. The neighbors came back in the warmer weeks. Some brought questions, others brought silence. No more laughter, no more disbelief. They didn't ask to see the thermal core. They wouldn't have understood it if she had shown them. But they listened now. And that was enough. The local authorities came once more, this time with less certainty. The woman in charge reviewed the paperwork, asked fewer questions. Her tone was different now, less about enforcement, more about learning. Claire handed over copies of her uncle's diagrams. Not all of them, just enough to answer what they were really asking. How did you make it through when so many didn't? She didn't use the word luck. She used the word preparation. One morning, as frost lifted off the trees like breath, Claire sat outside beside the cold stove. The dome behind her glowed gently, radiating the last of yesterday's fire. She thought of the day the letter came. The coffee gone cold. Jack at the kitchen table, unknowingly waiting for the world to shift beneath him. She remembered how small she'd felt back then, how uncertain, how alone. And now, she knew the weight of responsibility, the calm that comes not from comfort, but from understanding. The kind of understanding that sticks, that shapes how you walk, how you plan, how you protect. This wasn't just survival. It was stewardship. Claire didn't know if she would ever go back. But as she sat there, her son sketching in the dirt nearby, she knew this. She had inherited more than a structure. She had inherited a mindset. And the house, quiet, strange, enduring, had never asked her to change it. It had waited for her to become it. Not everyone would understand. That was fine. Some things don't need to be explained. They just need to work. Claire thought she was being handed a burden, a broken-down house in the middle of nowhere, built by a man she barely knew. What she discovered was far more powerful a structure shaped by intention, not convention, a place designed not to impress, but to endure. The house didn't save them. It taught them how to save themselves. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. And if you know someone learning to live differently, share this with them. Sometimes the things we inherit are the things that teach us how to survive.